Recently, there's been a lot of focus on spotlighting or green halo claims. These are claims where the claim made is 100% factually true, but it creates a misleading impression about the overall impact of a business. So these sorts of claims have been made famous by the UK's Advertising Standards Authority, with a series of investigations and findings against banks, fossil fuel companies and aviation companies. And so the important things to consider when making green claims are you making an accurate picture of your company's role in the green transition and where they are on the journey? So what is the pace of change that your company is making? The things that you are advertising and you are focusing on in your claims, how representative are they of the overall impact of your business? What proportion of the overall investment and capital expenditure of your business do they represent? If you take those things into account, then you'll prepare yourself against these kinds of claims. One of the first things that companies do when they're thinking about reducing their emissions is switching to renewable electricity. Then the issue comes of how do you talk about your use of that renewable electricity and what claims can you make in relation to it? Because the way that our energy and electricity systems work in New Zealand is that if you're taking energy from the national grid, then you're going to take a mix. You can't guarantee 100% renewable electricity supply. So unless you're taking your electrons straight off your roof and the solar panels on your factory, then you do need to think carefully about the claims you make about renewable electricity. So there's a couple of ways that you can manage that. You can either manage that through a corporate power purchase agreement and the use of renewable electricity certificates. These certificates, or while not regulated in New Zealand, allow you to purchase the greenness of electricity separate from the electrons themselves. So the care again that needs to be taken with the certificates is what claim you're making in relation to them. Are you just using them for the purposes of your emissions reporting? So if you're a climate related disclosures reporting entity, then you're going to be disclosing your GHG emissions, and you can use these certificates depending on the protocol that you're using in order to discount effectively your scope 2 emissions and your footprint. What you want to be careful is then going further to say whether or not your products are made with 100% renewable electricity, because if it's come from the grid, it's not factually true. We get a lot of questions about making green claims on social media, and this can be hard because green claims often involve a lot of detail in order to make sure that consumers understand the nature of the claim that is being made, especially if you're relying on finer points of detail such as offsets. So to be able to explain those properly, you often need more than a 30-second soundbite or an Instagram post. So how do you manage that? The key touchstone is to come back to the idea that it's the overall impression that matters. So whilst you might have all of the detail in a link in your bio, sending people there might not cure a overall misleading impression from your ad in the first instance. So what you need to think about is, can I make this claim in a clear and accurate manner without sending someone off elsewhere? If you can't do that, then you might want to think about not making that claim in that context and instead just putting it on a website rather than on social media. So it's always, what is the overall impression? The other general sort of takeaway for fine print and asterisks and additional points of detail is, what is the purpose of that? Is it additional detail or is it a qualification? If it's a qualification, or if it contradicts the overall impression of the claim, then it's not going to save you. It's still going to be misleading. So only ever use asterisks and small print for additional detail that will provide further context, not something which is going to sort of correct or over change the message of the total claim in the first instance. Businesses now often want to talk about being climate positive or carbon neutral. Often these claims are involving the use of offsets in order to achieve that level of independent certification about their impact on the environment. So it's important to realise with claims like this, it's an absolute claim. And absolute claims, as opposed to comparative claims like greener or better for the environment, have a much higher burden in terms of substantiation and proof in order to justify the claim. So if you are going to make a claim about being climate positive or carbon neutral, then you need to be very clear about the calculation that has gone into achieving that and the independent certification process that you have gone through. If you are using offsets, you need to disclose that you're using offsets, and you need to disclose the international program or domestic program that you are relying on in order to purchase those offsets. You also need to be clear about the basis that you've calculated it. Is this a particular product or service that is climate positive or carbon neutral, or is it your entire business? These claims also need to be assessed on a whole of life cycle basis. You can't just look at a thin slice of a product or service. You need to look at the entire impact and the entire value chain if you're making the claim. So care needs to be taken if you're making a climate positive claim. Finally, I'm going to talk about emissions reduction targets. So a lot of companies are setting science-based targets in order to achieve emissions reductions. So these are the sorts of claims that you see: net zero by 2040, net zero by 2050, with interim targets through to 2030. So with these sorts of claims, what you're really making is you're making a representation to the market that you have a reasonable basis to believe that that target is achievable, and that you have a reasonable pathway in order to get there. So when you're talking about your target, you need to be very clear about the dependencies and the contingencies which are there on that pathway. So be very open and honest about the difficulties and the challenges that you will face on the journey. If you are dependent on new markets or new technology being created, you need to disclose that. If you're dependent on existing policy settings remaining the same, or developing international markets for a particular key supply ingredient, then you need to be very clear about that. As you're going on your journey on the emissions reduction as time passes, it's important to monitor your performance against the target in order to make it clear, in order to understand that it is still reasonable for you to have that target out in the marketplace, that nothing has changed, that your assumptions are still sound, and that you're still on track, as it were. And if you're not on track, then you need to be clear that you're not on track, and there's more stumbling blocks, and that things might need to be revised. So with emissions reduction targets, it is important to monitor your progress, to keep an eye on your assumptions, and to make sure that you understand where you are on the journey in order to keep making those claims to the market.